The United States was supposed to be different, a nation born not of kings but of ideas, reason, debate, and unity. But by the time James Madison became president, that dream was already cracking. Foreign powers whispered in America's ears, newspapers fanned the flames, and political factions, once dismissed as dangerous, had become the beating heart of American politics. The Constitution was supposed to protect America from division. But what if division was always part of the design? This is Too Complicated for History. Welcome to Too Complicated for History. I am Isaac S. Loftus, broadcasting from, all of you YouTube viewers can see, a brand new space that is a dramatically lit white void at the moment, but that will change soon enough. And as always, I am joined by my wonderful co-host, Dr. Lynn Robbins.
Hey, everyone.
And we come to you twice a month to bring you the history that has fallen through the cracks of your curriculum. And today we have a guest who has, I think, probably the coolest book title of anyone that we have interviewed so far.
I would completely agree with that. Very excited to have Dr. Tyson Reeder. He is an assistant professor of history at Brigham Young University, and that book title is Serpent in Eden, Foreign Meddling and Partisan Politics in James Madison's America. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I'm very excited to be here, and thank you for the flattering introduction to the book. I do like its title as well.
Absolutely.
So just to give some overview of context before we dive into some of the details of this, while we were prepping for this, I actually made a very common mistake that people often do, in that I confused Madison and Monroe. Yeah. So could you give us just a heads up on, or just a brief light overview, if some of our viewers, like myself, are a little bit confused as who Madison is, because he comes right after sort of like the big three presidents that everyone remembers.
Yeah, so when a lot of Americans know about James Madison, they usually know him as the father of the U.S. Constitution, right? So much like at least a couple presidents who preceded him, he comes from Virginia. He's from the Virginia planter class, pretty elite Virginian, maybe not the uppermost echelons, but you know, he's a 1%er in Virginia. And so he early on is thinking a lot about constitutions, about especially religious liberty, religious freedom, separation of church and state, a lot of those issues. And he starts to, in the mid-1780s, in the midst of a lot of crises in in the U.S. economy and U.S. foreign relations, he starts to imagine a different type of charter that binds these new states together that, of course, will become the U.S. Constitution. He was very adamant, and correctly so, that he didn't write the Constitution. The Constitution was not solely his brainchild, but he does bring a lot of the ideas to the Constitutional Convention that end up in the Constitution. A lot of what he does becomes the foundation for what eventually becomes the U.S. Constitution. Therefore, he's often referred to as the father of the U.S. Constitution. He'll eventually serve in Congress in the 1790s, Secretary of State, beginning with Jefferson's election and his accession to the office in 1801, and finally president in his own right when he takes the oath of office in 1809. He'll be in the presidency during the War of 1812, which is where my story ends for all intents and purposes.
So we know that Madison was good buddies with Jefferson. Before we get any further, can you talk a little bit about the creation, I guess, of the two political parties, starting with just the ideology, because the ideology started and then they sort of became cohesive into political parties, but just sort of the two opposing viewpoints in early U.S.
Yeah, so the earliest two political parties, what historians often call the first party system, is between Federalists and Republicans. A lot of people hear this as Democratic Republicans. A lot of times historians use that term just to distinguish them from today's Republican Party, which wasn't really formed until the 1850s. So when I say Republicans, I continue to use Republicans because that's what they most often called themselves at the time, but it is different than today's Republican Party. And there are a number of differences. These parties form slowly. At first, they're just sort of broad ideologies. There's not a lot of party, there's almost no party organization to speak of. You're not signing up for a party when you register to vote or anything like that. So they start out as just broad, differing ideologies, but people will eventually come to call themselves a Federalist or call themselves a Republican. And what did that mean to most people? Broadly speaking, Republicans imagine a more, we'll call it a democratic society. They do have racial hierarchies in mind, of course. A lot of early Republicans come from the South and are enslavers and so forth. But at least among white men, they tend to be somewhat more democratically minded. They envision a future of a lot of yeoman farmers who are working the land agriculturally, which takes a smaller government. And because they tend to be more democratically minded, when the French Revolution breaks out, they're going to sympathize very strongly with French revolutionaries. And all of that versus Federalists who see a vision of the nation based a lot more on what they called the moneyed interest, commerce, bankers, things like that. A lot of these people tend to be from the North, so they're not quite as racially hierarchically minded. That's, of course, not to say there was no racism or racial casting in the North, but they tend to imagine a world that's built around more of a class hierarchy among white people. And they also, when after the French Revolution breaks out, they become skeptical pretty quickly of what they see as the chaos of the French Revolution. And after the French Revolution ends up with Britain and France at war, they a lot of Federalists envision their government more in the image of Britain than of France. And so they will be much more sympathetic to Britain. And so for the purposes of my book, that's really the strongest point you need to know about the two parties is you have the Republicans sympathizing with France, Federalists sympathizing with Britain.
Right. And it's it's so complicated. I mean, it's a great book, and everyone needs to read it because we cannot cover all of the great parts in it in an hour-long podcast. But I thought a good way to give an overview of your book would be to talk a little bit about the incident in your introduction. We have John Henry, and I don't know how to pronounce the second guy's name. Is it
Paul-Émile Soubiran.
There you see, I would not have done that well, so I'm just going to let you do that. And sort of their little plan together that ended up with them sort of bribing Madison. So I'll just let you talk about that.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. The introduction is titled "The Spy and the Con Artist." So what is happening here? Well, to sort of set the scene, we can think of a time when it seemed like American democracy or the early American Republic was teetering on a crisis, and the president had misused public funds in an attempt to get dirt from foreign adversaries on his political opponents. So I don't know if any of that sounds familiar, but what's happened is you have this Soubiran. And he's a con artist who's been going around Europe, defrauding a lot of the elites in Europe, posing as nobility from time to time, gambling, so forth. And Napoleon's police eventually chase him out of France, and he goes over to Britain. In the meantime, you have a former British spy, and this British spy came to the United States in 1808, and his job, as we can maybe get into the details of this later, but as it looks like war might be imminent between the United States and Britain, his job is to find out what are part of his job is to find out what are the possibilities that these New England Federalists might actually secede from the Union and side with Britain in its war against France, against possibly the rest of the United States. how can Britain use party politics to its advantage during this time? So he fulfills his mission. He gets this former spy's name is John Henry. John Henry fulfills his mission. He gets some information, but really just nothing that useful to the British. Nothing that they didn't know already. That Federalists really hate Thomas Jefferson and they really sympathize with Britain. That's about all he gets from his mission. Nevertheless, he's not compensated very well. So John Henry travels over to London. He's going to try to get better compensation from the British government, maybe at least some post, a lucrative position for his services or something. He's rebuffed, so now he's really mad at the British government. He feels used. He's falling into poverty. By happenstance, him and Suberon end up in Britain at the same time, and they both decide to sail to the Americas. Suberon needs to hightail it out of Britain. He's been up to his old tricks, and now Britain wants him out of their country as well. So he's leaving Britain for the Americas. John Henry is leaving Britain for Canada, for British Canada, and so they both end up on the same ship. And Suberon is going to learn about Henry's mission. They start to confide in each other. It seems to be a late night conversation on the ship, and they bump into each other, and they start to confide their troubles to each other. And Suberon learns about John Henry's disgust with the British government. He learns about these documents that he apparently still has that detailed his mission. And Suberon, being the con artist that he is, recognizes really only what a con artist of his caliber could, and that's a chance to profit off of this situation. So he poses as a count, the Count de Crillon, as he is wont to do, and he tells John Henry, you know what we can do? We can sell these documents of yours to the U.S. government. I'll pose, well, actually, he's posing as the Count de Crillon. As far as John Henry knows, he is this count from France. So he's posing as the Count de Crillon. He says, I'll use my influence to get us in good with the French government. They'll get us in with the Madison administration. We'll sell them these documents. They'll believe that we have all of this incriminating information about Federalists in here who want to secede and betray the nation and so forth. And I'll be back in good with the French government. You'll make a pile of money, and we'll do it by essentially defrauding the United States. So they bring they bring these documents to the Madison administration. Madison and his Secretary of State, not to make this more confusing, but this is James Monroe. Madison and the Secretary of State James Monroe do buy these hook, line, and sinker. They buy the documents, and then they start to authenticate the documents. And you'd imagine that a less avid buyer would have authenticated the documents before they got them. But they're so eager, they're so convinced that, yes, the Federalists are so untrustworthy. Clearly, there has to be something incriminating in these documents. It only makes sense. So it's not that they're corrupt. It's just that they live in a world that is so partisan that they can only imagine that clearly their political opponents are going to be colluding with a foreign power somehow. And so they buy the documents and they start to go through them, and they learn what was obvious to the British government, that there's some things that aren't very flattering about Federalists in these documents. They're clearly airing grievances about the Jefferson administration, and they clearly, some of them clearly have a strong affinity for Britain, but nothing incriminating. They end up with no names, no crimes. And yet, to me, I opened with this in the introduction because this just tells us the world we live in by 1812, that you have, oddly enough, Madison is colluding with these foreign agents because he's convinced that Federalists are colluding with the British Empire.
And they paid quite a bit. It
And
was was it $50,000?
$50,000. So to put that into perspective, I don't know exactly what we might equate it to in today's money, but to put it in perspective, Madison could have built a warship for about $53,000 to wage the impending war that he was planning on.
Goodness.
And it was
And
public money,
and,
correct?
and
It
it's
was
public money. It's coming
yeah.
from public coffers. It comes from what they called the Secret Service budget, not the Secret Service as we think of it, but the what is essentially the U.S. espionage budget.
Mm,
They empty the entire budget on this stack of papers. The entire budget. Um, in fact, more than the entire budget, they had agreed. They said, "Well, we'll pay you this much in cash," and then they made some arrangements, a little complicated that we don't need to get into. But they made arrangements to pay even more than that in the future. And so that's how desperate they were, and how bought in they were to the assumption that there must be something incriminating in these papers.
gosh, blows my mind.
Yeah,
It really goes
yeah.
to show you that when something is too good to be true, it's probably not.
Right. I mean,
Good lesson.
to
Yeah.
give one example. So somebody at one point when I was talking about this compared this to the Steele dossier, right?
Oh
That
yeah.
if you're familiar with the 2016 election, a lot of information about the Trump organization and collusion with Russia and so forth. And my response is, well, it maybe is kind of like the Steele dossier if the Steele
Mhm.
dossier were paid for with public money, if they were
Right.
using actual public money to pay for that. And as it wasn't. It was like campaign money, so private funds. But yeah,
Yeah,
I
if they
mean,
spent the
it's
entire budget of the CIA, the NSA, and the
Yeah.
FBI on
yeah,
one.
right. Yes,
Oh my
yes.
gosh.
Exactly so. So it's an amazing point. I mean, historians have seen this before. I mean, they've known about this episode before.
Hmm.
But you know, as times change, as we experience new things in history, we ask new questions. And
Right.
so, to me, this Henry episode just needed to be plied a lot more than it has in the past, because it tells us so much about how Americans eventually are going to end up in the War of 1812, on the conviction that clearly their political opponents had to be colluding with some sort of foreign power, and maybe you have to go to war to break up that collusion.
Right.
Goodness. I have a question about, well, we can save it for the end. But in the lead up of the War of 1812, like, when you start, I'm curious about, it like baffles me that basically these are still the same generation that fought the war. Like this is the end of that generation, really, like
Right.
in power. But this is still the same guys. What, how much unity there was around that endeavor falls
Yeah, this
apart
is
so fast.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is something that Madison recognizes pretty early on. And this is a lot of what gets him thinking about a new constitution to
Hmm.
scrap the Articles of Confederation. Is they come out of the Revolutionary War. And Madison is pretty forthright. I don't know that this Confederacy is going to last longer than the war. He's writing this after Yorktown, so it's becoming more and more clear they're going to actually win the war and win their independence. But he's looking at this saying, we had one common enemy. That these 13
Right.
colonies had a common enemy that united us, and not much else. The Americans are very different. They're different in their religion.
Hmm.
They're different in their languages. They're different in their races. They are. It's a very, very diverse group of people. You look around and you say, is there really that much to unite somebody who lives in Upper Maine with somebody who lives in Georgia, and have
That's
them
true.
think the same way, have them think that they're part of the same country? Once you lose that common enemy, is there anything really to unite them? And Madison thinks early on, probably not. What we're likely going to see is at least a few different confederacies form out of this
Hmm.
confederacy that we formed to fight the British together. And of course, their first, I guess, legal or constitutional attempt to bring some unity and coherence to these 13 colonies is the Articles of Confederation.
Hmm.
But we need to think of the Articles of Confederation as John Adams called it, which is just a diplomatic assembly, not a
Right.
nation to
Right.
speak of. Um, And as time goes on, Madison is going to have a variety of interactions. Maybe we can cover these a little bit later, but he's going to have some interactions, especially with the Spanish government, that that it's going to convince him that unless these states unite into a nation, they have to go beyond a diplomatic assembly and they have to form a nation that is more unified, more coherent. Otherwise, foreign powers are going to pick them off bit by bit, steal their sovereignty bit by bit until they've overtaken the whole. Um, as Madison has surveyed history, he feels like he's seen this time and time again. He writes about the Achaean League, the Helvetic League, the Amphictyonic League, all of these ancient leagues of or confederacies. And he sees the same pattern over and over again, that you have stronger foreign powers, and one part of this league is trying to get the leg up on the other part, and to do that they're willing to collude with a foreign power, so they surrender some of their sovereignty to a foreign power until before you know it, the foreign power is kind of taken over the entire league, and is calling the shots. He feels like he's seen this over and over again, and that he's starting to see it with the Articles of Confederation. So it's foreign meddling, this type of foreign meddling, that initially pushes Madison to be a strong advocate for a convention that's going to eventually terminate in the Constitution that unites these states, not into a confederacy, but into a nation.
Right, and it's interesting because going back to before there was a nation, you talk about how the colonies, even as they were colonies, were used as pawns in the European powers. Because you see Europe, or you see Britain, France, Spain, they're all fighting for land in the colonies. And then you also have the natives who are siding with whoever is going to benefit them the most. So even before we were a nation, it was this big chess game in the colonial US.
Yeah, it certainly was. A lot of that centers around the Mississippi region out in the West.
Mhm.
Why are European powers so interested in that region? Well, that's where you have so many of the outlets that get you down to the Caribbean. And that's the real prize for European powers, is the Caribbean. And so if you can control the circum-Caribbean, if you control New Orleans, for example, the lower Mississippi, then you can control, you have greater control over the Caribbean. You can stage troops there for protection, and supply it with food stuff that's coming from North America. North America is really important to Europe because of its not in and of itself, but because of its proximity to the Caribbean.
Mhm.
And so North America does become a chess match or a chess board for European powers, and Americans become somewhat their pawns. That is troubling for Americans, and yet at the same time, sometimes they know how to work it to their advantage. Much as you mentioned, sometimes Native Americans do. If you have
Right.
two major competing powers, then you can play their fears off against each other, and they're much more scared of each other than they are of you. So after, at the end of the war, when it comes time to make peace, in the peace of 1783 or the Peace of Paris of 1783, then Americans are, well, Britain goes to the American negotiators in Paris and they say, we will give you very generous terms, just cut the French out of negotiations. And so Americans get far more generous terms than they would have otherwise if it hadn't been for this existential fear that Britain and France have of each other. And in very close proximity to Americans that continue to trouble them after 1783 are these Native American nations. And
Mhm.
Native Americans who were not invited into the peace negotiations of 1783. And Native Americans may be telling their British or their Spanish allies, look, to you, this war may be over, but to us, we're still occupying the land that
Right.
you apparently decided the Americans are going to get. So to us, we're still in this. We still have stake in
Mhm.
this game, and keeping Americans out. And so and so Native Americans are going to continue to create alliances, confederations with Britain in the Ohio Valley, with Spain in the lower Mississippi Valley, to say, hey, as your allies or former allies, we want some assurances that you've got our back as Americans try to push into our territory. And so Americans are looking at these confederations being built right on their borders. Not only do you have the strong European component of it, but they're also making these alliances with Native Americans on their borders. And so that all creates for a lot of Americans, and for certainly for James Madison, again, this existential, what seems like an existential threat to this new Confederacy, and then after the Constitution, to this nation.
It, it
Absolutely.
it's really interesting in I'm curious as to your opinion on Madison's view of the presidency, because the first couple presidents weren't
Hmm.
members of a party.
Mm.
John Adams was basically a Federalist, and so was Washington, but they weren't actually active members of the party. But then that
Right.
starts to change with Jefferson. But as
Hmm.
far as like the role of the president, sort of serving and protecting the Constitution, um, it's almost like that by the time you get to Jefferson and Madison, there are enemies domestic that they
Uh-huh.
may seem as, but those are members of your own country. Like
Hmm.
where did he see the presidency? Sort of like, was the Washingtonian sort of perspective is to sit above the fray. I serve the Constitution above all else, and for the betterment and the unity of the country. But if you see the threats coming from within the country, then you
Yeah.
can't. Yeah,
I explore this a lot in my book. I mean, one thing that I try to explore is how introspective were people about their own politics. So we talked
yeah,
a little bit about the title to start, and my first really awful stab at a title for this book was Between Dissent and Disloyalty. And
okay,
uh, I mean, it works as a title insofar that
It's
it
very
kind of
descriptive.
gets at
Yeah.
what I'm getting at for the book.
Yeah.
I like the final title better, but Americans feel like they're somewhere between dissent and disloyalty, and this is a
Hmm.
serious problem, especially in a republic. In a republic that allows you to just rail at will against government leaders, that allows you to say all sorts of things and print all sorts of things about the government. In a republic, where is the line between
Yeah.
dissent and
mm,
disloyalty? And Americans just aren't sure they know where that line is. So Madison, during the 1790s, he's in Congress, and he's pretty darn sure that sovereignty lies with the people. The people are the sovereigns. And of course, that's what we all assume today.
Hmm.
But Americans have been steeped in a culture. I mean, the early Americans had been steeped in a culture that said sovereignty lay with a monarch, and therefore, and sovereignty lay with the government. And you still see some lingering assumptions about that. No matter how much they paid lip service to sovereignty lies with the people, when Madison is in the in the opposition in the 1790s, he is completely convinced that sovereignty lies with the people, and they need to maintain the right to rail against their government, to try to topple not the government but their government leaders, when they can, when elections come up. Um, and then he enters executive power as
yeah.
Secretary of State in 1801, and then, as you mentioned, the presidency in 1809. And all of a sudden, Madison, like the Federalists that he had been railing about, is maybe feels a little more like sovereignty should lies with the government. That the
Hmm.
people, that if you are attacking the government,
Hmm.
that it's some sort of corrupting activity, and that you might be tiptoeing towards some sort of treason, or at least a deep disloyalty to the
Right.
nation. And so Madison is going to flip. And in fairness to Madison, so do Federalists when they're in power versus when they're out of power. And I rarely saw, in all of my studying, I rarely saw instances of deep, serious introspection about this, and trying to draw strong ideological consistency between this.
Hmm.
And a lot of it just boiled down to partisan politics.
And it seems like definitely when they're in power, they don't want dissent. When they're not in power, they're all about dissent. That's very modern day. That is come through the years. But
Right.
a few things that are a little different is, first of all, when you say the people, today when we say the people, we think all Americans. That's not who the people were at this time. And also how they defined a republic, because it wasn't one unified description of what the nation was supposed to be, correct?
Right. Yes. So when they say the people, they obviously have a much more limited understanding of the people. It of course doesn't include enslaved people. Sometimes it doesn't include free blacks even. Um, and it marginally includes women, but only insofar as they're represented by a husband or a father,
Mhm.
somebody who a male who has some, presumably has some stake in their claim, right? So the body politic is much smaller. Native Americans are an interesting. They're a little bit difficult for early Americans to grapple with. They're
Right.
within American boundaries, but there's so Native Americans become somewhat of a composite. They're seen as maybe the most dangerous because they can be internal dissenters and external actors at the same time.
Sure.
So you have those dynamics to the body politic, um, and and yeah, when they imagine a republic, as John Adams said once, had so many different definitions to it that it came to mean everything, nothing, or everything or nothing at all, or something along those lines.
Right.
Um, and so Americans weren't entirely sure where sovereignty lay. Um, and they created a constitution that is itself even today a little bit ambivalent about
Mhm.
where sovereignty lay in terms of state power, federal power, um, and and so sovereignty was a major unanswered question. So you get foreign agents. The two strongest examples I think of this in the book are one that most people might, or a lot of people who are familiar with this time period will be familiar with, and that's Genet, Edmond Charles Genet,
Mm.
the
Mm.
the revolutionary French ambassador who comes in 1793. And another, though, that people are less familiar with is the Spanish ambassador or the Spanish diplomat, the Marquis de Caseirujo. Both of these men come as diplomats representing their governments, but they recognize something has changed with America. Once America became a republic with purported sovereignty in the people, what does that mean for foreign relations? What it means to these two men is that you can engage with the people. You can publish things in newspapers that attack the current government or the government leaders. You can engage. You can try to turn the people against their government leaders. That's what it means for them, because ultimately the people have sovereignty. You're not engaging in any sort of underhanded diplomatic tactics. You are simply engaging with the people. And the parties in power, Federalists in the 1790s and then Republicans in the 1800 aughts, they're the party in government power is going to say no, 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 no. Like you have to engage with us.
Yeah.
Maybe the people have some sovereignty, but that does not mean that you get to go and engage with the people. And these diplomats, especially like I say, Irujo and Genet, are going to say, well, why not? Look, are you a republic where sovereignty lies with the people or not? You can't have it both ways.
Right.
You created this new type of nation, and essentially lay in the bed, lay in the bed that you made.
So after thinking about that, and then the sort of the structural corrosion that happens when you even just thinking and participating in all of this sort of back and forth does to you, when they found out that these papers basically had nothing in them, how does Madison and the government react when they're like, oh, I guess there's
Oh,
nothing
like
here?
like any good government official does, they try to cover it up.
Sure.
Some things don't
That's
change.
yeah. So right. So that's so that's what they do next. What they Monroe goes to John Henry and asks him to write a cover letter, and in that cover letter, John Henry seems to strongly imply that he's giving these papers to the Madison administration, not charging the Madison papers for the administration. John Henry has a problem though, and Soubiran. It gets a little complicated, but Soubiran learns how to get his cut out of this $50,000. So the problem for Henry and Soubiran and Madison eventually is that it turns out it's really hard to essentially cash a $50,000 check on the government without some people learning and taking some notice of this. And so word leaks out. It becomes known pretty early on that Madison has dumped a whole ton of money on this on these papers, and so it becomes a cudgel for Federalists. And Federalists are looking at this saying, Madison paid $50,000 to prove nothing more than that we didn't collude with Britain. And Madison, for his part, he's going to have at least enough to say, well, I don't have names of Federalists, maybe. I mean, Madison remains convinced that there are people out there who were engaged in this, though. But he said, maybe I don't have names of Federalists. But what I do have from these papers is pretty good proof that Britain was certainly trying to sway Federalists, get Federalists to collude with it. So he does have that. So he takes that narrative to the nation when it comes time to declare war. And he says, when he's listing all of Britain's sins against Americans, and if you're familiar with the War of 1812, you'll recognize some of these: impressment, the Chesapeake affair. He's listing meddling with Native Americans, trying to incite Native Americans to violence against Americans. He goes through these lists, and he does include the Henry affair, even though it's kind of given him a black eye. He says, if nothing else, we do know that Britain was meddling in our politics, trying to pry Americans away, trying to gain their allegiance. And so we're adding that to the catalog of sins.
Right. That's not as, being 100% honest here, that's not as bad as I thought it was going to be.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, what did you expect? And maybe I can confirm it and we'll make it work.
My favorite sort of dance that happens when sort of these kinds of things happen is like, well, they're so bad that I believed it. That I thought it was possible, right? But it's not my fault that I believe this thing. Look how crazy they are, right?
Yeah, and
right.
Like I said,
right. That's just as bad as the thing itself.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. I mean, Madison does in private. It's clear from his private correspondence. He just remains convinced that Federalists are doing this. So to some degree, you're right.
Okay.
I mean, he's not. I don't think he has a leg to stand on publicly with that. But in fact, he's so convinced of it, he starts writing to diplomats in Paris after Soubiran returns to Paris. When Madison is still convinced that Soubiran was who he said he was and so forth, he writes to his diplomat in Paris and says, hey, we need you to get in contact with this guy because we need names. Like this has turned out really embarrassing, essentially. I mean, he doesn't say that in his letter, but clearly what he seems to have in mind is this has turned out really embarrassing for us, but we're still convinced we're right. Clearly this had to have been happening. They're at least among what we might call the high Federalists, people who he would say were part of the Essex junto, for example. Like the worst of the worst Federalists have to be colluding with Britain. It only makes sense. So get us names, get back together with Soubiran and get him to give us some names, because he just remains convinced that it's happened. He's not doing that publicly. Now, what I do say I don't know if it's in defense of Madison, but to be fair to Madison, here is I do not think I maintain I may not be explicit about this in the book, but for me personally, I maintain that Madison, I'm not sure I can define what Madison did as corrupt in the sense that Madison is so convinced that he's not corrupt. Maybe he's just deluded in this one in this one particular point, right?
Sure.
That he is just so convinced that it only makes sense that his political opponents are doing something criminal with a foreign power.
Hmm.
And in that sense, he's no more corrupt than a lot of other a lot of people before him who were convinced of the same thing about Madison. If
Right.
we go back to the embargo of 1807, right, when
Hmm.
the United States is trying to wield its influence over Britain and France, they're tired of being treated like pawns between Britain and France. So, what is the solution the Jefferson administration comes up with? They say, well, we're just embargoing everybody. We're not trading with anybody, and see how well you can fight your wars without our grain and our food stuff, our wheats, and so forth, to feed your armies, right? So they're convinced this is going to work, and it ends up being a complete disaster for them politically. It's a disaster economically for the nation, to just stop all foreign trade.
Right.
Um, but they're convinced that this is the right approach and it will eventually bring Britain and France to heel. But the Federalist line is going to be, clearly this is a ploy of Napoleon. And so,
Mm.
because maybe on the face of it, the embargo is kind of neutral. It's supposed to embargo both Britain and France, but we all know that we have way more trade with Britain than France.
Hmm.
Right. Right.
This is meant to hurt New England Federalists, and Britain is going to be the Federalist line. And so
Right.
so Jefferson and Madison are clearly patsies of Napoleon. You have Federalist sketches, political cartoons that show Napoleon promising Jefferson that he's going to be made a king of America in return for instituting the embargo. Or there's another one where Napoleon is basically reading his instructions aloud to Jefferson and Madison, and they're just following Napoleon's instructions. And so this isn't something that out of the blue that is isolated to Madison.
Hmm.
Right.
Madison lives in a world where on all sides the distrust is becoming such that when it comes to Madison, it makes more sense to him to trust this megamaniacal con artist and mysterious British former spy than it does to trust his political opponents in the United States.
Well, I think that assessment is, a huge indictment of what partisanship does. It makes
Yeah.
non-corrupt people acting in a non-corrupt way do things that are detrimental to the
Mm-hmm.
country and the institutions, because they think they're doing the best that making the best decision that they can, given the reality.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
And Madison, in doing that, he's just essentially proven to the Federalists. They see, of course, it is corrupt. So
Oh
he
yeah.
thinks he's going to find out what the Federalists did and end the corruption. But in doing so, he's doing something that the Federalists then see as corrupt.
yeah,
So they're feeding into each other, it seems like.
Yeah. It creates this cycle, and as parties become more suspicious of each other, that just creates a wider chasm, with more leeway for foreign powers to continue to operate. Um, and so the book goes through a number of these episodes.
Now I have a question to as a way to defend Madison's allegations of corruption or partisanship, and something I'm just generally curious about. Does he ever make a decision throughout his presidency or when he's in executive power that is overtly bad for the Republicans, like that he knows to be the right choice, but is bad for the party that he is affiliated with?
The embargo. The embargo. I mean, he's not president at the time, but the embargo is his brainchild. Madison, much more than Jefferson. In fact, this I will say: historians usually see Madison as the person who sort of restrains some of Jefferson's worst impulses. When it comes to That's usually true. When it comes to Britain, Madison is more apt to inflame Jefferson's worst
Ouch.
impulses.
Oh,
Okay.
gosh.
Madison is, in my estimation, much more suspicious of Britain even than Jefferson is. Um, Madison institute. So the embargo is something he's been pushing for a long time, and he, in fact, going clear back to the Constitution. Part of Madison's goal coming out of the Constitutional Convention is he wants a trade war with Britain. He feels like it's something they can't wage, that Britain is taking advantage of the United States economically, and the United States cannot fight back as long as it's under the Articles of Confederation. So a major goal, in fact, the very one of his very first speeches in Congress in 1789, Madison stands up and he says, a trade war with Britain is the entire reason that we have this new constitution in the first place. So let's get on it, people.
Right.
So he's been advocating for this for a long time. He basically gets his wish with the embargo, and Madison is convinced this will work. He's convinced that the early United States has the economic clout to make this work. It doesn't. It's terrible for Republicans. And Madison, though, Republicans will eventually repeal it, largely to save their own political skins. But Madison is they're going to do it over Madison's objections. When they repeal the embargo, it still irks Madison into his presidency. He's upset about it, and he's convinced it is the right path, no matter how much pain it's going to cause his party, no matter and really no matter how much pain to him in the short term it's going to cause the nation. This is the way that we are going to gain our respect among European powers. So I hope that answers the question. Is can we see instances where Madison is working against his party, pursuing a policy that actually is bad for his policy, that is bad for his party, and yeah, I mean, again, Madison, I think throughout his life I think all of us essentially wants to think he's doing the right thing,
Right.
Yeah.
is not in his head, maybe except for the most crass politicians, is not in his head saying, I don't really care about any result of this other than my own good political fortunes. I don't think Madison thinks that way. But like Madison, it's really hard for us to determine the line between our own politics and our principles, or between our principles and our politics. And that line can get very fuzzy.
Right, because I'm wondering, did the two parties just have completely different ideas about what was good for America, or what the US needed to be? Or were they just willing to put their party above the nation, or what was best for the
Yeah.
entire nation?
Yeah, and I think the answer to that changes as the parties become more entrenched, especially
Mhm.
after the mid 1790s. We don't need to go into all the details about the Jay Treaty, but Republicans saw the Jay Treaty in 1795 as a complete complete submission to Britain,
Mhm.
and so that really starts to solidify people thinking in terms of, I'm a Republican, you're a Federalist, we're political opponents now. Before that, I think people did worry about different ideologies. So if you were kind of what we'll call maybe a proto-Republican, somebody who will become just a full-throated, I'm a Republican and this is my party person. If you're a proto-Republican, you have real ideological commitments to why you think the French Revolution is a good thing, why you need to support the French, and so forth for proto-Federalists, right? But what Americans early on realized, and I think we need to recognize the election of 1796 as a real pivotal point in this, when Americans really Washington is stepping down. It's going to be the first
Mhm.
contested election in U.S. history. And Americans start to say, for my ideology to win out, my party has to win. And so principles and party become very knit together in a way. I mean,
Mhm.
that I think, in fairness to Americans today, who when we give into our partisan impulses, of course has some merit to say look,
Mm-hmm.
if I want to institute my principles and my ideologies, we need to win elections, and
Right.
Right.
so it takes some party loyalty. So it's a very difficult. It's a conundrum. It's something that
Mm-hmm.
it maybe it feels like it doesn't have answers. Certainly not easy answers.
Right.
So to get back to a question that I sort of tabled from earlier, in the lead up to the War of 1812, as Madison is starting to lay out what those list of crimes against America from Britain are, does the return of the external enemy change that sort of faction divide at all? Does the dynamic between them, heal? Does it bring it back together? Like, hey, now we have this external force, like sort of bearing down on us that we
Yeah.
could burn the
Mm-hmm.
White House, right? Like, it is does that change things, or does it still stay as divided as it had before?
It will eventually. It will eventually change things. And what I mean by that is you have a lot of Federalists who are against the war, right?
Right.
And
Mm-hmm.
now the Federalists have just been. I don't want to give the impression, because it wouldn't be true, that this is like a 50-50 split. Since 1800,
Right.
the Federalists have been losing power and losing elections pretty consistently and more
Mm-hmm.
in greater numbers throughout history. So despite the unpopularity of the embargo, Madison still wins election that year.
Right.
Right.
And so Federalists have been losing um, influence already in the government for some time, and so, but they're a strong and vocal minority that's against the war. And Republicans themselves, you do have a faction of Republicans led by John Randolph who just hate Madison. I mean, they have policy differences with Madison, and in addition to those, they just hate Madison. And so you have Republicans who are also who feel like maybe this war and Madison as president is all meant to strengthen Madison's wing of the party, and they join Federalists in being suspicious of that. There will be a strong and vocal minority against the war, and that itself is going to lead into questionable tactics, like when the governor of Massachusetts refuses to commit Massachusetts militia to the war effort,
Mm-hmm.
for example.
Hmm.
And Federalists do convene the Hartford Convention in 1814, and in which the way I put it is they flirt with secession. They don't actually go, they don't end up going there, but the idea is on a lot of minds, that they're so convinced that this new nation is that they just can't they can't continue to work with Southern Republicans. Um, and so ideas of secession are floated as late as 1814, and the Treaty of Ghent will be signed by early 1815. So pretty late in the war, there's still very strong opposition. The accusations of foreign collusion continue to be flung around during the war. Some of these are actually created by uh, British author or British artists for American consumption. But for instance, they portray, a couple of British artists portray Madison again as following Napoleon's orders. When Washington is burned, they portray Madison as fleeing to Elba to join the exiled Napoleon.
Hmm.
And so this dynamic continues. But what Republicans successfully do throughout the course of the war is reframe the war as a second war for independence, for U.S.
Mm.
independence, and that Britain is trying to recolonize America. Now, Britain may have certainly, some British people did harbor dreams of full-on recolonizing America, and others, more mainstream though, is Britain is trying to do with America what it is trying to do with all other weak nations, and it's make it economically dependent on them. In terms of how accurate those accusations were that Britain is fighting a second war to recolonize America, it sort of depends on, it's a little bit fuzzy. But Republicans do successfully reframe the war as a second war for independence. So you come out the other side of the war and you look
Yeah.
around and say, hey, we're still independent. I guess we
Mm-hmm.
won the war. And victory in war creates popularity in politics. And so nobody wants to associate with Federalists anymore. This vocal minority who was against the war, who even talked about secession in the midst of the war. And so it is going to eventually lead to um, what is essentially during the Monroe administration to what historians now call the era of good feelings,
Mm-hmm.
when not everybody agreed on every issue, but it is a period of about 8 years where we don't see the type of hyper partisanship that we often see in American history,
Like the 90s.
like the 90s. Yes,
Okay,
yes.
sure. Makes sense.
And I think like politics has always been, it certainly seems like it's perception over reality.
Mhm.
Um, and in that case, what I'm thinking of is, we have 24/7 news cycles now. We have the internet. There's a lot of reasons to dislike politicians. So you said people didn't like Madison. Now, apologies for saying this. I can understand why you wouldn't like Jefferson. Not policies, but just as a human being. So I'm
Okay.
wondering, what was it about Madison? No offense to Jefferson.
Uh,
But what was it? Was there something about Madison personality wise or a reason they didn't like him other than his policies? And how are they learning about him? Because
yeah,
you don't
yeah.
have the,
Well, I
internet,
guess
24/7 news.
yeah, I guess when I say they hated him, I mean I think that's true, but I think it does have some root in policy. So you have the John Randolph, and he's the leader of this wing of the party that really doesn't like Madison. Randolph Madison is the person, going back to the Constitution, everybody knows it, who did sacrifice some state prerogatives in favor of national power, right? And so when Madison starts to when the war drums start to beat, Madison is the one in the presidency, and it looks like
Mm-hmm.
maybe Madison has always been a little bit too in favor of federal power, and now he's president,
Right.
and
Mm-hmm.
we think maybe he's probably a little too federalist, is what some of them are actually thinking.
Okay.
And John Randolph, I mean, there are very few people who John Randolph didn't upset in Congress. And so you do have a clash of personalities, but there is some root in just a really deep distrust of Madison.
Mm-hmm.
It starts during the Jefferson administration with the embargo, that
Right.
saying this is what the national government can do, just stop all trade, right? So the suspicions start with Jefferson, but everybody knows that it's Madison who attended the Constitutional Convention and tried to give some of these
Right.
powers to the federal government, and yeah, maybe he's
Hmm.
wielding them in suspicious ways now. I
So
think is
all
how a
roads
lot of
lead to
thinking.
Jefferson.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
So, given that, is Madison the serpent?
Ah, oh my. So they no.
Okay.
No. Yeah, the serpent. I would just say that the serpent is this cycle. It's this cycle of partisan politics that allows foreign powers to meddle in those politics, that widens the chasm of partisan politics and gives foreign powers more room to meddle in U.S. politics. So the serpent in Eden is that really vicious cycle between partisan politics and foreign meddling. And I think for Madison, I think one thing that maybe is important to highlight: Madison did not believe that there needed to be an end to political parties. Going clear back to the Constitution, Madison was saying in the
Mhm.
Federalist Papers, he essentially, if you a government that can snuff out political parties is snuffing out liberty. As long as you have liberty, you're going to have political factions. That's just a
Right.
reality. Madison's question always was, how do you turn those political factions into an asset for the nation, not a liability? And what I think we see during the war, by the time of the War of 1812, they had become a liability. So and
Mm-hmm.
I think in an era that we're living in now, it feels like they have become a liability. And so I feel like I end the book with a modest proposal. I don't spend a lot of time on this. I'm not a political scientist, but maybe we can look at some models that political scientists have proposed that maybe get us closer to an original Madisonian vision, where you don't have two behemoth parties going at it head to head that automatically split the nation in half, and one half of the nation hates the other. Maybe there are some good proposals that are worth exploring that produce more parties, more factions. For Madison, the more factions, the better. You're not snuffing out liberty. People are free to create factions or side with factions, and yet you're not. No single faction is becoming an oppressive majority. That's how Madison originally envisioned factions. It doesn't work out, and he does get caught up in his partisan days in perpetuating a system that more and more abandons that original version. But maybe the problem to the answer to the Madisonian problem in the book is a Madisonian solution.
Yeah.
I can see from that perspective why Republicans would think he was too much of a parliamentarian.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if I like this guy's ideas.
Right. Yeah.
But that makes a lot of sense. It's definitely a great thought to consider, and an era that was really important to look at, and one that most Americans have not, because it comes, after the Revolution, after the Constitution, in the era when we're really trying to figure out how we govern ourselves. So if you're listening, definitely go check out Serpent and Eden. Not only does it have a cool title, very memorable title, but we'll have the link in the description and the show notes below. And as always, this conversation was brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon. So if you want to get some behind the scenes look at the making of the show, you can go check that stuff out there, and some early access to some exclusive content. Go check out patreon.com/primary source media. We also do book giveaways for some of the hosts. And also some silly things from that are generated in our efforts of doing some really really interesting history content for you all. You get to see all the blooper reels over there. If you're still with us, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I know I did. Thank you so much, Dr. Reeder, for being on with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.